Okay, well, I think if you look at the world today, capitalism is quite undoubtedly now a global system, that spans to every corner of the world and so on. But when Marx and Engels were writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, capitalism was just, I like to quote Duncan Hallis used, just a pinprick in the pennines at the time. It was, the working class was tiny at that point. And yet the Communist Manifesto was able to quite confidently proclaim that let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution, workers of the world have nothing to lose but their chains, they have a world to win. And I think Marx and Engels were quite confident about this at the time, despite the small size of the working class, because they were able to describe the drive and development of capitalism, that this was a process in which the system creates its own gravedigger, and that was the expansion of a working class across the world that has the collective economic power to destroy the system. And it would have been explored in more depth, I think, in the previous meeting in the series. But capitalism is a system that is based on exploitation, where you have a minority who own the means to produce in society and who profit off of the exploitation of the workers who are forced to sell their labour in order to survive. And because the system's profits are based on this exploitation, and because workers' collective labour is what produces everything, workers have this immense economic power in the system that by withdrawing their labour, they can grind the whole thing to a halt, really. So I think these conditions of exploitation, the fact that the system's constantly attacking workers, is, you can see it throughout capitalism's history, continually drives people to fight back. And people do have this, you see glimmers of this huge power that people have when they do resist. And I think, the key argument really in this meeting is that now you have some who argue that the working class has been transformed so much that it no longer constitutes a force for change in society. And it certainly has changed in a big way since Marx's day. It's massively grown. If you look at how we could try and quantify what that is today, I think there's somewhere around 1.6 billion people who are counted as wage labourers in the world, and that's probably about just about over half of the kind of the global labour force of people who actually labour in society. And although this figure obviously is there's a number of problems, and it's quite difficult to quantify really. It also includes people who we wouldn't in a Marxist sense count as working class, people like managers and supervisors and so on, who have a stake in the system and so on, and are more part of the middle class. And it also doesn't include people who don't actually labour themselves but are working class in the sense that disabled people, elderly, children, people who are reliant on wage labour in that way. But even if you take that figure, as an indication, this is obviously a huge force. The working class has grown massively since Marx's day, and I think we're now also in quite an unprecedented situation where half the population of the world actually live in towns or cities, and there's quite a few areas where there's not been a growth in the number of wage labourers. So if you to give an indication of that, really, if you look in 1950, you had 86 cities worldwide that had 1 million inhabitants in them. In 2001, this rose to 400 cities where this was the case, and by 2015, it's projected to rise to 550 cities. So this is definitely a process that's been going on. China's quite an extreme example. China added more city dwellers in the 1980s alone than all of Europe, including Russia, did in the entire 19th century, which is really quite staggering growth in that sense. Especially if you think about what happened in Europe in the 19th century and so on. So the last decade has seen an increase in wage labourers in China that actually equals 3 times the total number of wage labourers that there are in Britain. So this is absolutely massive growth. But of course the whole process globally is quite uneven. This isn't the case that this is obviously happening on that scale everywhere in the world. Chris Harman wrote in an article about how can we address the question of how to end world poverty in 2005, and he said success in trade in the modern world is only possible if you have a high level of investment in modern technologies. And so what this has meant is that ruling classes in poorer countries have had to try and find ways to keep up with this process, either by ruthlessly battering the working class and intensifying that, or getting into debt and so on. And some places have done that quite successfully, but as different poor countries are competing with each other to sell, they can often force the world price down for the things that they're selling, and actually this can have a knock-on effect to send them backwards. So there's examples of this in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in the 1980s, where the point where these industries were beginning to break through. In particular markets, the Chinese industries launched a mass export drive that actually undercut them and has had an impact to actually cause a whole process of throwing a whole number of countries across that area backwards in that sense. But the general picture is one where you've got a growing global working class, and I think really, what's at stake, the crucial question for this meeting is whether or not we think that the working class has been transformed to the extent that its power is diminished now, and that we can no longer look to it as the force that can change this horrible system that we live in. And I actually think it's actually more powerful than it was before, and that you've got some myths there that I think it's important we try and take up. The first, really, if you look at the kind of developed, highly developed countries, to use that phrase, you can see that there's been obviously a decline, the decline in manufacturing, and there's an argument that this has been a huge shift, so that now this is now focused in the global south. But actually, something like 70% of industrial production still takes place in the richest 21 countries, and so and to give an indication, really, the global picture. Manufacturing output makes up for about 16% of the GDP of countries in the highly developed countries, but in the rest of the world, the global south, it's 23%. So it's not a huge discrepancy there. But what there has obviously been is a transformation in manufacturing, where there's been a decline in manufacturing jobs, but actually output hasn't significantly changed. So what you have is a situation where a reduced number of workers are producing, using an increased use of machinery and so on in production. So I think actually what this does is concentrate power more intensely in the hands of a smaller group of workers, rather than taking it away from workers in that industry. So you've got the example of the car industry in Britain, where in 2005 actually it was almost the same output as it had been in 1970, which was so-called sort of heyday for British manufacturing in that industry. So I think this, rather than this taking power away, it's actually concentrated power in a smaller group of workers. And you also have a situation where the production process is taking place concentrated across different regions, where groups of workers in different factories will play a particular role within the production process, which again I think actually, instead of taking power away, in a sense gives workers still are quite powerful. You can have one factory, if there's a dispute or a strike kicks off, actually this can hold up the sort of the whole process of production, even if it doesn't involve workers in other factories and so on, because of the way that the production process takes place. So while there's been a transformation in manufacturing, it's hardly a picture where it's all kind of up and moved to the global south, and where workers have been stripped of their power in that process. And I think the other argument really is around the shift towards the service sector, which has undoubtedly taken place. This has happened, and I think there's a notion that this shift means that real jobs, inverted commas, in manufacturing have been replaced with something that's fundamentally different and that we can't quite see in the same way. And the implication, I think, is that there's not the capacity for workers to have the same power collectively, because workers are more atomised, they're less skilled, they're less organised, or they play a less pivotal role in the production process. But the service sector actually includes a whole number of jobs that, when you look at them, are skilled manual jobs. You think of postal workers, bus workers, transport workers, maintenance workers, air traffic control. The list kind of goes on. Actually, these are hardly workers without some kind of power. And often I think people don't realise actually that workers are still often concentrated in quite big workplaces. Like if you think of Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, which is just south of the river in London, that trust employs some, thousands of workers are employed there, and anyone who is going to go out over the next few months and try and leaflet outside their hospital for the big national demonstration over the NHS, which of course everybody should do, you'll notice that actually these are huge hospitals, are huge workplaces where you've got people streaming in and out throughout the day and so on. And actually in Britain, most workplaces people work in, there's 50 or more workers, but actually many of them there's a lot more than that. In America, the average workers in a workplace is 500 plus. So this sense of people being atomised, actually people are still in quite, still in quite collective situations. What I think is obviously becoming quite clear now is that public sector workers have moved into the centre, of the organised working class, and are in a position to lead, quite a serious fight back that has the potential to pull in other workers that aren't quite in that organised position. And this is the case not just in Britain, but you can look over a whole number of the strike movements that we've seen over the past few years. Greece is a key example as well, and the role that public sector workers play in the system for maintaining the workforce, and therefore the production process as a whole, is actually something that's a vital role in the system. So that you take the example of the Brighton bin workers who were out on strike for 7 days solid a couple of weeks ago, and it was absolutely clear that these workers were people who had power. You just walked down the streets of Brighton, you had rubbish strewn all over, across the road, rubbish piling up on street corners from day one of the strike. These were people who clearly had a power, that, and actually there was a battle that took place, and people might have seen some of the statements that the strikers put up on Facebook and so on, because you actually had local business owners who were sent into a sort of spiral of panic about the impact that this filthy Brighton was having on their business, and they actually launched a campaign where they tried to pay homeless people a pittance to get them out, to sort of essentially scab on the strike and go out and clear up the area so that it wouldn't hit their profits too bad, and make you had people out sweeping their own little patch in front of their business and so on. So I think this notion that people in the public sector don't have power, this is clearly still a very powerful group of workers that can lead in quite a significant way, I think. And the notion that workers in supermarkets and call centres even, that these people are atomised, I think is also quite misleading. Obviously these are often jobs that are very, very difficult to organise in. They're often very, very, difficult jobs to try and have any kind of resistance in. But the average call centre worker actually stays in a job for 3 years. So I think it's quite dangerous to begin identifying workers who are unorganised, and therefore the most likely to be with some of the worst pay, the worst terms and conditions. As a result of that, it's dangerous really to try and classify these as fundamentally somehow different from any other group of workers in capitalism's history, because casualisation of work, unorganised groups of workers, shifts in dominant industries and sectors, these have all been constant features really throughout capitalism's history, and the shifts that have taken place in recent decades are nothing new in that sense. And that actually also what you see throughout capitalism's history is that there's always struggles going on, battles to win recognition, fights for better conditions and so on. And this has actually often been spurred on by, not always, but often been spurred on and led by the more organised sections taking a lead in the fight that can pull these people behind. So I wanted to go on and look very sort of anecdotally at the Global South as well, and try and pull out some arguments from that, which I'm really just only going to kind of touch upon, that people can come back on in the discussion. But I think going back to this question of having the huge migration from rural areas into towns and cities, this has been a very, very significant process. And in China, where we've already kind of looked at this, has been quite a staggering process. This has happened alongside also a kind of a growth as well, new jobs being created and that kind of thing. And I think the result really has been that you've seen quite a remarkable rise in workers' struggle on quite a mass scale, where people are being thrust into struggling to defend pay and conditions, and that a number of these disputes have actually been successful to some extent, and that's allowed workers, I think, to gain a bit of confidence and been able to draw lessons from the struggles that they've seen. And I don't know if people remember the May 2010, when you had 2,000 Honda workers in China who forced the closure of the multinational plants across the country, and this strike was massively significant, not just because it was an incredibly powerful one, but actually because it was a turning point. A lot of the disputes up until that point in China had been quite defensive. This was a point where actually it was an offensive dispute. It was an offensive strike, where they were specific targeted demands, fighting for parity with other plants, parity between Chinese and Japanese workers and so on. And I think despite actually what are quite very real difficulties of operating under circumstances of illegality, workers actually went out and organised on a rank and file level to the extent that you had a core of them who actually negotiated with the management separately from the state-run official unions, which the workers described themselves as completely useless. So you had strikers picketing openly and so on, or finding new ways to organise and communicate. And I think that's quite a powerful example actually, but it's not always the way these things take place. I mean, people might have also seen the stuff around the mass suicides at Foxconn in China, where actually the cynicism and brutality, really the system, I think, was laid bare in quite a shocking way, when the boss's response to this situation was actually just to install nets around the workplace. Absolutely disgusting when you respond to this kind of tragic form of protest, to show that really this was just an interruption for them, for their profits, and they were going to find some way to try and overcome that. Also in January this year, you also saw quite interestingly quite a highly political strike where you had hundreds of journalists at the Southern Weekly newspaper in China who struck against censorship, which again I think is a bit of a reflection of the kind of confidence that people might have gained through the other strikes that you've seen there building up. But China is quite exceptional in the sense that the mass organisation that's taken place often hasn't been accompanied by this kind of process. I think it's estimated that between 1980 and 2010, the rural population across the Arab world dropped from about 60% of the total population to around 40%, and this was an estimated 70 million people left the countryside to go into the urban centres. That figure represents nearly the equivalent of the total number of people who moved from rural areas to urban areas since the beginning of the 20th century, right through to the 1980s. So it's been again, you can see this process has been quite significant. But it's not only in a climate of jobs growth or that militant strikes can develop. Part of the backdrop, I think, to the Egyptian revolution was the kind of the neoliberal policies that saw unemployment rocketing alongside a rise in job insecurity, destruction of large parts of the welfare system, so that in the decade running up to 2006, the percentage of workers with contract actually dropped from around 62% to around 42%. And similarly, the percentage of people who were covered by social insurance in some way fell from around 54% to around 42%. But what you can actually trace, despite that, over the past decades is a pattern really, in Egypt, where you've had political struggles feeding into the economic struggles and a kind of cross-fertilisation that's continued, up until the revolution, and obviously strengthened it in quite a significant way. There's also an argument, really, which maybe people can come back on in the discussion more, really, that urbanisation has developed in such a way that, you've had this huge influx to towns and cities in many places, but without the kind of growth in jobs with contracts, formalised hours and wages and so on, and that this means that vast numbers of workers, which they are now in the informal sector, in a situation where, they don't really have any power and so on. And, I think the position that these people are in really do make it quite difficult to resist. You have people who'll be in situations where people can think about it, the people who maybe sell things on the side of the road and so on, people in this informal sector, which clearly are, it's very difficult to see how people can organise and use economic power. But often actually, a large number of these people who are involved in that informal sector are also, work in a casualised way for parts of the year where they're in, either in factories or in situations where they're part of a larger workforce in a more casualised way for a part of the year, and are therefore in a collective situation where they do have power for those parts. So it's quite a complicated picture, I think, but it's we can't completely write these people off, I think, as having any kind of economic power. But the point is that actually often people who are working in this way can be pulled in behind the struggles of workers who do have more formalised jobs, who are better organised, and that's really the theme, I think, is that the places where workers are better organised, that definitely do exist across the globe, are the places that can pull in much wider layers of people behind their resistance. And I think we started the meeting really by kind of noting how the working class has massively grown since Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. Marx pointed to the critical development at the time that he was writing, which was really that for the first time, when you had class societies, capitalism had created a situation really where the class that was oppressed by the system actually for the first time had the power to actually do something about it. And this, if you look at the time of the French Revolution, this was not the case, that all the oppressed classes that existed at that time actually had the power. The historic possibility didn't really yet exist that people could have the power to actually run society for themselves and take over. And capitalism transformed this situation. So rather than being in a weakened position, really, I think now, where the working class are no longer relevant, we're actually in a far stronger position today in terms of workers having power to transform society. Because we don't need a situation where you have a majority of people, or every person, all the people who are exploited by oppressed by the system are workers in the Marxist sense. But what you do need is you need to have a cores of working class people who have this economic power to change society, all over the world, which is something that we do have now. And if you look at the Russian Revolution, obviously, the working class was an absolutely tiny percentage of the overall population at that time. But what you saw was the people who didn't have that economic power coming in behind and linking up with the workers who did, and the workers who were able to fundamentally seize power, really. So I think the fact still remains, really, that workers make production happen, they run society, and because in every country and every society across the globe there is this core of workers that has that power, there is still the potential for us to be able to fight to get rid of the system altogether. And I think, you look at the example of the Marikana miners in South Africa, which there's a whole number of meetings on at Marxism, so I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I just think that's clearly an example of a group. You look at what is workers' power like. The power that those workers had, is absolutely immense. When you think about, mining platinum, it's not something that's just an incredibly expensive commodity. People using jewellery. There's obviously a huge market for it, but actually something that's used, in every vehicle that runs on oil across the planet. These workers have this incredible power, but yet had it lived in circumstances, where actually, really dreadful, appalling conditions, of housing, of wages and so on. And actually, what you saw, I think, was with the savage murder of those strikers, you caught quite a shuddering glimpse of just the extreme lengths that the state will go to. And this was because of how important those workers really are, of how much power those workers actually had. And I think it's inevitable throughout capitalism that workers will be thrust into battling against the system's attacks. Especially as we're seeing the system plunge deeper and deeper into crisis. Workers are being squeezed more and more, and Marikana was just one of the many flashpoints I think that we've recently seen across the globe. You can list them, not got time to talk about them, but you look at Bangladesh, Greece, obviously, Egypt, Brazil. General strike yesterday across the country. This will continue to happen. Capitalism will continually force struggle to take place. But the development of those struggles into some kind of socialist revolution is certainly not inevitable at all. It's not inevitable, and it will take, conscious, organised political argument in the course of these struggles in order to try and win such a position and such a strategy. So having the potential power alone is not enough for a revolution. It's when workers are politically conscious of their power, and when this idea of solidarity takes hold, that actually this becomes possible. The idea of solidarity, I think, is incredibly powerful and absolutely key. Really, and there's quite a well-known example that people might know. I think it probably was possibly on Socialist Workers' front page at the time, which was during one of the miners' strikes in the 1970s, where it reached an absolutely critical point. The bosses needed to get the coal moved by trains across the country. This was absolutely vital for them. And obviously this situation raises questions for the strikers who've been battling, having picket lines, stopping scabs and so on, where you can actually confront people coming into the workplace. How do you stop a train? How do you picket a train? But they found an answer to this because of the determination of their struggle, and people will know the example where they went out in the night and spray painted over one of the stone bridges over the crossing the track, NUM official picket. And actually, when it came to it, the train driver saw that and stopped. Actually, you've got this huge, powerful train carting all this coal across the country. But that simple idea of solidarity, that simple idea that there were workers fighting here and that they had the same interests as you, was far more powerful than a train. And actually, that driver refused to cross. And I think this current of thinking is something that has to be nurtured among the working class. One that fights to raise this idea of solidarity in every single struggle. Where we understand the objectives, we understand the possibilities, and of course the obstacles in the situation that we face, and whether or not there are going to be socialists fighting, inside the working class for this idea, makes the difference in the course of every single struggle, and that's probably one of the key lessons that you'll take throughout all the discussions at Marxism, really. And I think the starting point for that is a belief that the working class is a force for change. This is not really an abstract question, it's an absolutely concrete one that comes up in workplaces every single day. You think about the barrage of attacks that people are facing, and constantly people ask themselves or each other, is there anything we can really do about all this shit, or don't we just have to take it? Is that not, that's the ideas that people have been given, from when they're born, that you can't do anything to change it. And I think that, therefore, given this is a battle that we have to take up, in this battle that we have to say, no, we do have the power to change it, we have to organise to do that, any argument that's going to underplay the relevance or size of the working class or the power that it has isn't just actually wrong. It's also something that's a massive impediment for workers actually realising the power that they do have.
All right. Question for everyone. I just arrived at Marxism and saw this. I've just arrived at Marxism. This is all about the global working class and why the working class is global now. One thing I think we should also consider, I'll explain why, how much can social media actually make global working class reality? For example, when Morsi was overthrown recently, one of my friends on Facebook, without any prompting from me, and they live in Malaysia, posted up saying congratulations to the people of Egypt for getting rid of the dictator. When I joined a conversation with her, and it's the reason why she posted that was she felt exactly the same kind of frustrations about her life and how oppressive it can be, as people in Egypt probably do, and probably still do, as to this day. People are experiencing the same kind of similar oppressions all over the world. That's why one reason why there is a global working class, because people are oppressed by our rulers all over the world. But people now communicate this over Facebook or over social media all over the world too. Can this help build up solidarity? That's my question.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'd just like to ask a question about what you think the importance of the peasantry is in this new world. Because you talked about how the working class in the global south has increased massively. And surely the flip side of this is the attack on the present way of life that capitalism has perpetrated throughout the 20th century. And I think this is something that's been quite overlooked as well by socialism, because still we have rural workers and peasants that feed 70% of the world, and their way of life is also under attack. And I think we need to recognise the importance of alternative ways of living and alternative ways of producing that don't conform to the capitalist model. And I think in this, with the solidarity thing, I think we need to recognise the importance of the rural workers as well as the workers in cities, workers in terms of subsistence peasantry as well. I think that maybe we should just have a more collaborative way in which maybe the subaltern indigenous peoples can talk back and we can learn from their different way of life. Yeah.
I wanted to say something about the relationship between class and oppression, because I think this is something that is quite often, we talk about exploitation and oppression often in the same breath, and we sometimes necessarily hammer out what is the difference between the two and why they're both important, because I think one of the things that is really really clear to me about all the struggles that we're seeing in the world at the moment in Egypt, the mass protests, people taking to the streets in their millions, is that it's often not led by the organised working class. In Egypt, just before the fall of Mubarak, the organised working class kind of sparked off that wave of protests in its sort of initial stages. But then, when the movement really kicked off, it was not sort of expressed through those means. We make a point of saying that it was the general strike that was called the night before or the week before General Mubarak actually was removed from power. That was the kind of tipping point. But it wasn't in the kind of interim period. It was people taking to the streets because of a feeling that they just couldn't cope with the living conditions and the exploitation and the oppression. It was kind of a whole series of things that brought people out onto the streets. So I just think we need to be really clear that often it's oppression that drives people to struggle, And class, the reason that class is important is not simply because it's class that people recognise that they're exploited and therefore this makes them angry and they struggle. But class is important because that's what gives us the power to actually win these fights. And I just think that sometimes we don't emphasise the difference enough. We need to absolutely argue that class is important because it gives us our strength. But we also need to recognise that it's oppression that brings people into struggle in the first place, and we need to take inspiration from those movements.
Yeah, I was reminded when Julie was speaking there at a family holiday years ago in Dordogne, and Julie was a wee girl at the time. And I remember we were stuck in a huge traffic jam, and we're quite irritated by this, and we're very, very pleased at the end of it to be given a leaflet by some strikers who had stopped all the traffic. This was in Dordogne in France. And they were on strike over union recognition and a wage cut. And then we'd taken away their leaflet, and we managed to kind of work out what the reason for the strike was. And next day we went down to the picket line. It was never a holiday for Marxists when you're on holiday. Down to the picket line. And they were so kind of grateful that the fact that there was this expression of kind of solidarity from people, from another country who were over on holiday and so on. And what it reinforced to me was two things. First of all, that wherever you are in the world, even in advanced, developed countries like France or in the global south, you will see exploitation of workers by a ruthless capitalist system. But what it also shows is the flip side of that when workers organise collectively, when they start to fight back against the system, they actually can become a force for social change. In the case of these striking workers in the Dordogne, they actually did achieve union recognition. And the wages, in fact, weren't cut. And when you think of actually what's happening in the global south, that Julie actually illustrated in some depth here, it's actually quite exciting to be a Marxist in many respects. If you think of what's happening in China alone, the scale of the urbanisation and the potential for the growth of trade unions and other different organisations, who will fight back. There will be reverses, there will be defeats. But actually, I'm very fortunate to have, for many years now, been a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, which is part of a wider international socialist tendency that tries to make kind of sense of many of the strikes and struggles that go on here and in other parts of the world, and in some ways help to kind of connect them, join them up, and if possible try to give some kind of direction and leadership. I'll leave it there, in fact.
I'm not related to Julie in any way. My name is Sue Bose. I'm a member of Unison Brighton and Hove, and it was actually our comrades in the GMB who were the bin workers of every strike. I wanted actually to use that example as a very small example about to illustrate Julie's point about how better organised sections of workers can actually inspire other sections and in other ways. I mean, we yesterday had a by-election in a ward in Brighton and Hove, the one I actually happen to live in, Hanover, which is noted for voting on, broad left lines most of the time. The Greens had a 1,200, the Greens are the ruling administration in Brighton Hove, as you probably know, the only one in the country. They've passed on the coalition's cuts quite happily, have been a great disappointment. They had a 1,200 majority in Hanover ward the day before yesterday. They lost yesterday, they lost that whole majority. Unfortunately, people voted Labour, but that's another meeting. But they lost that because people supported the bin workers. The streets were full of leaflets that the bin workers put out at the time saying, would you like to lose £4,000? Because that's what the dispute was about. They were trying to cut their wages. They've now had an offer and they're still waiting to ballot on that. But the bin workers actually lost the Greens' seat on Brighton Hove Council. So that was one very important consequence. The other one, which is I think probably even more important, is that last Saturday we had a big meeting to launch Sussex Uniting the Resistance sort of trade union network, actually hosted by SWP comrades and organised largely by them. And bin workers came along and they spoke about their dispute, the fact they took 2 days unofficial action and then they followed it by a week. And you should have seen Brighton, you know, helped by the seagulls who love tearing open the bin bags anyway. The place was a real mess. They came and spoke and inspired lots of other trade unionists in perhaps areas like Worthing and Eastbourne, you know, other places in Sussex where there isn't actually such a good organised, you know, network of trade unionists. And it was very, very inspiring, and we hope obviously, you know, that will help to strengthen disputes and strengthen solidarity in our area. So that's just a small but practical example.
Sorry, let's laugh at marketing now. I think Julie's talk's right to start by emphasising the continuing objective power of the working class. I think South Africa, the Turkish general strike, the events that happened in Greece obviously demonstrate that on a massive level. I think it's also worth noting that they're all strikes with a central political component, particularly the struggles in Egypt and Greece, developed around the question of democracy, against neoliberalism, against the attempt by the Troika and the IMF to impose austerity. But I think if we're going to sit in a developed Western country, we also need to address the question of why is that objective power not manifested itself in the sort of struggles we'd like to see in the last few years. And strike figures in the UK, in America, in Germany are at historically low levels. I think we need to start to look at an analysis which recognises the role of neoliberalism in breaking up and incredibly weakening working class organisation at the base, which has an impact on the subjective way that working class struggle manifests itself. It's seen an increasing centrality of political questions in terms of how people struggle, as a reflection of the fact that people reject what the government is doing, don't necessarily feel the confidence to act independently at work, but do have the confidence to organise on the streets, to organise around political questions. And I think for revolutionaries, we need to both push forward on those elements where we can see the political question, but also the opportunity to get people to struggle, but also try to address the question of how do we transform these moments into the sort of revolutionary movement we like to see. Because the reason we talk about the working class and their central role is because workplace organisation has the possibility to have a collective confidence and consciousness which translates the experiences people have today into the sort of consciousness of solidarity and struggle, which points the way to a different society. And I think it's not enough simply to celebrate the brilliant strikes in November a few years ago, the strikes that have been led from above. We also need to think about how do we as revolutionaries utilise the political consciousness people have to attempt to rebuild that sort of workplace organisation and confidence. Because one of the notable things, we can talk about the Brighton bin workers, we can talk about the big national disputes, but the question is why have these more radical disputes not generalised in the way that we would hope? But that kind of network of officials and rank-and-file activists who generalised struggles in the 1970s, the sort of people that generalised the struggles around Mahalla and Egypt, around the campaign to bring down Mubarak, how do we regenerate those people? I think to do that means actually starting to analyse the shape of the working class today. Something that revolutionaries and ourselves in the SWP have been very poor on for the last 30 years. I think it's a real shame it's been almost 30 years into a serious analysis of the shape of the working class today. And it's more than time enough that we start to address that question with a serious debate about what actually is the balance of class forces in Britain, what is the level of trade union density, what is the real situation of workplace organisation on the ground, what is the consciousness of workers at the moment, and how do we transform the struggles today into the revolutionary possibilities we want to see tomorrow?
I can't answer that one, sorry. I'm a member of the SWP from Birmingham. I've got like a series of questions and basically a couple of points. I'm really sorry I didn't get to the start of the meeting, so I don't know if you talked about this at all, but I'm interested in what is the relationship of students to the working class and how should revolutionary socialists relate to them. In 2010 there was the massive student demonstrations that gave confidence, and that as a result we had the massive TUC demo, that as the student confidence fell, it seemed to me so did the workers' confidence partly as well. A couple of people have already made the points, don't make them anyway. We know that capitalism will breed resistance, absolutely, but we don't know where that resistance is going to come from or what will spark it off. I mean, in Tunisia, it wasn't an organised worker, it was, a street seller that sparked the massive resistance. In Turkey, it was an environmental issue that sparked the massive resistance. So the resistance isn't necessarily going to start from within the organised trade unions. But we also know that, not all resistance in society does sort of filter down into any sort of organised working class resistance. I really got politically active during Stop the War, where there was, people all over where I lived were politically active. There was massive street demonstrations, millions of people turned out in London, but there was very little of that actually fed through into any sort of working class confidence, in the workplaces. And I wonder what, our analysis really is of that, about, what that says about the confidence that we have. Sorry, this is written. Back to students again. I heard on the radio the other day that the students in Chile, the school students in Chile, are out on strike again, and they seem to be out on strike sort of every few years here about the Chilean students, and I wondered if anyone knew what the situation was and how they relate to the working class in Chile, and if the working class in Chile were part of it. Chris Harman wrote a brilliant book about the fire last time and what went on in 1968. And in France, the students were out on the streets protesting, and the workers were out, and they were all on strike. And the Communist Party then didn't want the students and the workers to get together, because they were frightened that there was going to be a revolution in France, and they didn't want that to happen in France at that time. And the students and the workers were kept apart. So I'm wondering how we can bring the students and the workers together. Thank you.
A couple of points. Firstly, when somebody asked about subsistence farmers, and actually, I've done some travelling. When I've been staying with people living in rural Indonesia or rural Tunisia, you find out actually still tied into the local market. I mean, they do actually, they do rely on bits of work where they get paid, like breaking rocks in the river, basically, for agriculture in Indonesia. They are tied in, and they are very aware of it. And if you talk about subsistence farmers, they do try and grow their own food. They can't grow enough for themselves to feed themselves completely, and they do things like where I was in Indonesia, they called red rice, which they sold for 50p a kilo, and bought white rice for 20p a kilo, which was subsidised. But it's not easy to subsidise the red rice. It's actually fetches a much greater price. So there's very few people who really are not tied into the global economy in some way now. The idea that you can actually grow it, people buy their clothes, they get their clothes from somewhere. Very few people actually still make their own clothes, because actually it's much more time consuming than trying to get the money together to buy something, even if it's second hand and being imported by charity. In terms of where working class consciousness and solidarity is, you can say that there's less of a sense of it. I think people are less confident about being active, but where it happens, during our strike 4 years ago, our London Relief Fund, we were out for between 14 and 20 days over the period of summer in 2009 in London. We had collected £140,000 from donations and so on. But the thing the problem was that with industrial union, people are very proud of our tradition, and we could win without help, which isn't entirely true. That money was necessary to stop some people having to go to work or lose their homes, basically. It did come down to that. But people who got the money, most people didn't come to the picket lines, they didn't see the solidarity, there wasn't that political connection. When it comes down to the connection between the economic and political strike, that was both, because it was against privatisation, but it was also against several-year pay freeze and massive attacks on our terms and conditions. And so people didn't, and it was also against the Labour government, which our union was funding and is still funding. So there's a contradiction, and there's no real way of squaring that. It's how you actually trying to make those links, and I think it's people's lack of confidence of standing up and fighting. Even campaigning this week against privatisation, very few even of the full-time officials are convinced and the members are convinced of the need or have the confidence to actually stand there and do leafleting on the stations when there is massive public support and hardly any hostility. So it's how you actually try and tie those things together. I don't think it's true that we haven't had an analysis of where the working class are. I think it's the confidence going out and pushing it in a time when there is actually very little industrial action, and that does cause frustration.
Somebody once said if you've got 15% of the working class on strike, it's a general strike, and 20% of the working class in struggle is an insurrection. So forget the 100%, that's for the Socialist Party of Great Britain argument that everybody will not have socialism until everybody is convinced of socialism. It's a relationship between those who want to fight, those who sit somewhere maybe, and those who want to stick the boot in to those that want to fight, right? And that relationship in every workplace, whether you like it or not. So if you go on, get in a car or on a cycle or bike and go around industrial zones, what you will know is that somewhere in that factory, in that workplace, is somebody saying in a canteen, probably quietly, we should be fucking fighting for higher wages, right? But the question of confidence, it's a question of example, but it also is a question of analysis. A few years ago, and probably younger comrades might not know, but there was a wee column called Birdie, right? And everybody was miserable. The working class is down, it's gone, it's finished. And wee Birdie, Jack Robertson, who sat in a wee office getting information because he was employed to get the information for the bosses about exactly what was happening in the world, because they needed the information, they needed the analysis, they needed the facts. So they gave the information to the little data gathering operation, right? About how wage rates are paid and this and whatever. And actually what we've learned from that is that the class is still there. Clough used to say, 1984, I laugh, right? Very bad accent, right? I laugh, he says, they tell me there's TV cameras. I say, who makes the TV cameras? The question of the class across the scale of the world is there, but we now have to understand the impacts of how people's confidence, how they relate as a class. It's a question of how they fight as a class. If you fight for a fiver for yourself, you're not fighting as a class. You're fighting by class struggle. But when you fight for somebody else, that's why it's really important that we want people to fight for people who are affected by the bedroom tax. How we're obsessed by that. But we have... Really? Okay.
Thanks for that. I took the opportunity to be pausing breath. I have got an awful lot of people trying to get in. I'm trying to get as many as possible in. So that's why I'm going to ask the people to be
Yeah, Comrade asked a very important question about the peasantry, and I think it's very important we try and respond to that, because the reality is, for people in the Global South, the period has been one of massive transformation and change. And often when we talk about the peasantry, people have an idea of the feudal peasant on the manor, the lord in the castle, and so on. That situation has changed. The vast majority of agricultural labourers are drawn into circuits of capital on a global scale. They have a connection to the market. Most of them exist as small commodity producers who essentially employ themselves and their families to produce. But other ones are actually wage labourers. They're drawn into the process of wage labour. They're employed in large farms. And other ones are very, very rich peasant proprietors. It's a very, very diverse sphere, and it's seen enormous changes in the last 30 or 40 years. That's the first point. The second point, if that's true, and if those people by and large face enormous oppression, why do we go on about the working class in the Global South? And I think it's not simply the question of power. Power is a critical element, because power to hold production remains a crucial form of power in most of these societies. It's not just that, it's also that the working class have an extremely homogenous position in society, very, very different to the peasantry, which are cut across with lots of differences, lots of diverse interests, and the working class can therefore form a solid core of people that can pull other oppressed groups behind them. I think that's critically important, that the working class can begin to pose a solution to the problems of these societies and the kind of oppression that much wider layers of people face in these societies. The final point really is about what we see as a solution to the kind of oppression that people face. And here I think we have to be quite wary about saying we simply defend the type of lifestyle lived by independent peasant proprietors, because actually for many of them it's a life of drudgery, hardship and misery. We have to be honest about that. People suffering from debts, from barely being able to scrape enough together to survive. We want to take control of the productive resources of capitalism in order that we can farm in a sustainable way using whatever technology is available to us. And I think that will be a range of different ways of farming in different areas of the world. But in order to get there, we have to harness a collective, homogenous power of central society that can break the rule of capital, which ultimately is what oppresses these people.
I just want to concentrate on a couple of the questions, firstly on oppression and then on Britain. And I'm going to principally talk about the trade union movement here in Britain. I think there's nobody can tell lots of us who've been battling in unions how miserable, you know, it's been under liberalism for workers. We know we've got the toughest anti-trade union laws across Europe. We know we were there when our side were getting battered to buggery in the 80s. But what I want to talk about is the resilience of our side, because I'm a GMB member. GMB are the third biggest union in this country. I went along to a conference this week, and my branch is a small branch. My branch has got 120 members in it. And I went and I was staggered by the resilience of our side. To be quite frank, women workers in the GMB, it's projected next year, will be the majority for the first time ever in the history of the GMB. You think of the GMB and it's boiler workers and, you know, guys who, you know, used to make, you know, this, that and the next thing. Now, when you talk to people, it's women workers. Lots of them are really low paid, and this is where oppression comes in here. Because if you're a low-paid women worker, your wages are getting bolstered up by benefits, or your rent's getting paid for you by benefits. So you're more likely to be affected by all the cuts in benefits. So you're more likely to be out on the streets about the bedroom tax and the attacks that are happening on your family. They're all interlinked with each other. You can't say one is separate from the other. The other thing is the huge blocks of workers. Now, I was absolutely agog at this, but British Gas, which has been privatised, where guys have gone from working in depots and offices, lots of them actually work from home, is 98% union density, GMB density in British Gas. It's incredible. There was 200 shop stewards up in the gallery cheering on somebody, their stewards retiring. It's huge blocks of people. Council workers, spoke to women council workers, and I'm sitting here thinking about my branch. Everybody I spoke to, how many people are in your branch? 2,200, but that's not including the caretakers. You know what I mean? I was quite shocked by it, because as I say, I don't come from a background where I'm in a workplace like that. The other thing is, the last thing is airport workers. You know what I mean? 100 years ago, we wouldn't even have been talking about that mode of transportation. Absolutely massive branch down at Heathrow with the GMB. Over 2,000 people. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's been tough, you know, for our side, but our side are resilient, and you would be surprised at just how rooted and big our side is. So please don't go away from this thinking we're buggered and there's no working class anymore.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on when Sue was talking earlier from Brighton. I thought she described very well the impact that bin workers had. But I went down there and, you know, you go down to that dispute, they didn't so much walk out, they walked in. They walked into their canteen and they held mass meetings there. And, you know, to be honest with you, that spirit of when the comrade talks about 1968 and previous struggles on a level that, you know, in my lifetime, we haven't really seen, that spirit, that sense of people's ability to transform things and their potential power is certainly there, and you can feel it. It isn't a confidence that exists across the whole of our class, but at various different times we get glimpses of that and our power to fight. And I think there's a danger that you can oversimplify the interplay, if you can talk about exploitation and oppression, or the question of politics and economic struggles. I thought it was interesting, and the other thing I wanted to talk about was spontaneity, because I think it's interesting. When you listen to the comrade speak last night from Brazil, what did he say? He said, if you'd have asked us 2 months ago, would there be demonstrations and strikes, he would have told you, no, you are mad, the mood does not exist in Brazil at the moment. And time after time, you listen to the comrades from around the world, that is the experience that they have. Things can still change extremely rapidly inside of society, can't they? And yes, we can talk about the demoralisation that people feel, that we haven't had a strike since November 30th, 2011. I do not believe that that mood inside of the class inside of Britain has gone away. I think people are angrier. I think they're more frustrated. I think, when I was speaking to my mate, Alex is a teacher, in Islington last night, the sense of joy he felt when someone from his national executive said, you are going to be out on strike 3 times in the autumn. People want a lead to fight. He said he was going to be proud to march into his school this morning and to turn around and tell people that. And our job is how do we generalise that and push our trade union leaderships. The last point on the question of exploitation and oppression was a brilliant little example. People might remember, Julie talked about the size of the GMB branch, the cabin crew strike up at Heathrow, where thousands of cabin crew were out on strike, a brilliant strike where they returned vote after vote to go out on strike. I was privileged enough to be out there and selling socialist worker and all the rest of it. They got attacked. I expect cabin crew get a lot of sexist and homophobic abuse, and they got attacked by some of the pilots in the press, and they got called bum boys. Right? Absolutely disgusting, homophobic attack designed to try and split the strike. What was the response of the cabin crew? I thought I was hallucinating, but as people walked into the strike centre, they were all wearing pink. In other words, they had an organised response over the question of oppression in the midst of that strike, because they understood the need to fight and stay strong. I think sometimes we can I think there's a danger. I think we have to go back to Rosa Luxemburg and the question of the mass strike and the interplay between the political and the economic.
I mean, I agree with the last couple of speakers who said that we need to talk up the resilience of our side, not talk it down. And then I mean this about the working class. We're not really here to talk about the working class, we're not here to talk about the ruling class too much. I do think we need to talk about the weaknesses in their side, rather than play them up. I think it's wrong to also downplay what happened in November 2011 around the pension strike. I mean, we were the on strike, but whole sections of our union branch refused to cross picket lines of other people who were in strike. And the reason our union branch refused to cross the picket lines was we were not called out in strike, because our pension's a private sector pension, and we wanted to go and strike over that. And it was local government workers who were on strike over the pension strike. But our members felt they should have been out on strike and refused to cross the picket lines. It was secondary illegal action, and we're still waiting to hear about the court order or anything. It never happened. That happened in lots of workplaces. Now, to say that that's not significant is a joke. It really underlines the resilience that's there, and it hasn't gone away. The bitterness is still there. Look at when there are ballots. Look at the ballots against the privatisation of the post office. The ballots are returning giant figures. We're having another ballot over pensions. It will return a big ballot in favour of taking industrial action. So the role of the union leaders is important. I want to talk about the other side as well. Folk talked about 1968, and how the students triggered what happened in France, and that's absolutely crucial, the role of the students there. But what happened in France 68, before the big activity, if you had read the newspapers or listened to the pundits, there was a man who wrote a book called André Gorz. I think he wrote it, was published in April 1968, and it was called Farewell to the Working Class. The tragedy for him was it was published a month before the biggest general strike in history, which nobody predicted. All the factories and workplaces, the banks, the shops, the Folies Bergère were occupied in France in a vast movement that developed a period of a month. That's what's potentially there. That class is not going away. There was occupation movements triggered in Britain a couple of years ago. If the November the 11th thing had been taken forward by the trade union leaders, it would have mushroomed as well. So let's not downplay things. We have problems. Yes, we have to look at the changes in the working class, but let's not be pessimistic or blind as to what's really happening.
I want to give an example about the global working class and what it looks like, and also what global working class solidarity can look like. Because when in Bangladesh recently, over 1,300 workers were killed when the building collapsed, the initial response of other workers across Dhaka was to go down to try to help in the rescue operation. Their second response was to go on strike. There were all-out strikes across Dhaka, with roads completely blocked. All the major roads into Dhaka were blocked, and some factory owners declared holidays. They declared holidays because workers were on strike and nobody could get through, nobody could move. A lot of workers from countries like Bangladesh go to work in other countries overseas to try to get enough money to send back to support their families. And at the same time as the Rana Plaza collapse in Dhaka, there was also workers in Greece who were on strike because they hadn't been paid for many, many months. And the response of the owners was to shoot them. And a lot of those workers were Bangladeshi. And they organised a rally in Greece, and we were able to get messages of support from garment workers in Dhaka speaking via their mobile phones, which are broadcast to workers' rallies in Greece of messages of solidarity on both sides. I work in Tower Hamlets, where we've got a large Bangladeshi population, and we decided, and it was an initiative that came up at our Unite the Resistance meeting, that we'd actually have some solidarity and some twinning with garment workers and the garment workers' trade unions in Dhaka. And we had collection sheets which were organised. We got the local mayor, who's a Bangladeshi man, to support it. Every trade union in the council supported it. And we had collections in every workplace in the borough and raised thousands and thousands of pounds to sensitive trade unions in Bangladesh. So it's just one example of what international global solidarity can look like.
And without any further ado, Julie's going to try and sum up all those points that were raised. Yeah, okay, just to start, I suppose, I mean, on the question of the person who raised the question about the peasantry, and I think that's people have obviously come back on it a bit already, but, you know, I think you talk about, wouldn't the process that we've talked about how we want to have some kind of global working class revolution be something that would attack peasants' way of life? And I think, you know, if you look back to like capitalism's sort of earlier development, and you look at it as a, you know, a hugely traumatic experience. I mean, probably a lot of people haven't, but there's a really beautiful and harrowing book called Sunset Song, which I read when I was quite young, and you know, it's about really the time round about the build up to the First World War, where you had, you know, a whole kind of small sort of croft and sort of peasant farmers that lived around parts of Scotland who were forced through either, you know, being sent off to go to war, being pulled into the cities, you know, to become part of the kind of, you know, the process of going down to work in the factories and being, you know, families being ripped apart. All this was a part of capitalism's development, where, you know, it ripped people out of situations that they were in, and was incredibly traumatic. But actually, at the same time as it did that, it actually put them in a situation where, you know, they actually now had a collective power where they could transform, you know, their lives into something much, much better. And I think that, you know, that's the kind of world that we're fighting for. And so, you know, yes, that process can be traumatic, and, you know, yes, there would be, you know, it would be, you wouldn't have peasants hanging on to the way of life that they have at the moment. But as I think Joseph said, this is something that, you know, is not necessarily something that we should glorify, and we can fight for something much, much better for people, that we, you know, can be pulled in behind the struggles of the working class, fighting for everybody to live in a society where we all have what we need to survive, and, you know, everybody plays a part in that. On the question of you know, class and oppression, you know, I think that's right. Of course, you know, you look at what's happened in Egypt, you've seen, you know, how the you know, the mass mobilisations in Tahrir Square, which have, you know, not always been led by, you know, the organised working class, it's been something that's, I mean, that was partly why I mentioned the thing about the cross-fertilisation between the kind of, you know, political struggles that you've seen going on there, and that feeding back into the workplace in a way that gave workers confidence. And actually what you saw when the workers did get on board, and when you did start to see the strikes developing, inspired by what was happening in Tahrir Square, this had an enormous weight actually onto what the you know, the movement's you know, impact, really, because, you know, they started to hit back economically against the system. So, you know, I think that's right in a sense, but, you know, I also think that, you know, people are driven into struggle by the exploitation, they're driven into struggle by the economic attacks that they face. But, you know, you look at something like the pension strike, which was, you know, an economic attack on people's pensions, but actually when you went on the picket lines, what I think was, you know, really incredible was the level to which there's such a high level of politicisation among people at the moment, while there's not very much confidence. So, you know, despite the fact that people were out on balloted on pensions, when you went along to speak to workers in the picket lines, people were talking about, oh, so why are you out on strike today? Oh, I'm fighting for the next generation. Have you seen what they've done to, you know, EMA? Or have you seen what, you know, people are generalising between things at the moment. So I think that, you know, it's right to point out that the November the 30th strike was a strike that was called from above, and that we're not in a situation where, you know, workers are confident enough to be able to push for these strikes themselves. But, you know, what you saw in the process of that strike was, you know, a whole sort of opening up in a process where people's confidence was able to be lifted because they could look around and see, you know, the tens of thousands that were marching, you know, whoever was on the march that they were on. This happened all over the country, and despite the quite low levels, I think, of confidence, the strike was actually an incredibly active one, where you had people organising around picket lines and stuff, where this had never been through that process before. And yeah, I mean, I think so what you've got, yeah, it's right to say that we've got quite a kind of generalised high level of politicisation going on, and people being mobilised in that way, and people, you know, around the anti-austerity movement. But also what you've got, I think, is a significant minority within the organised trade union movement, and you can see this right through all the union conferences this year. You can see it most clearly in the 36% vote for, you know, Jerry Hicks in the Unite election. You can see it in the fact that you can call these regional teachers' rallies around the country that were supposed to be a kind of build up to the strike, that were actually quite tame, and you know, they had quite a lot of, you know, the top table barely mentioned strikes or whatever. But I went to one in Birmingham, 800 people turned out. People want to see a fight back, I think. And you look at the strikes, you know, the strikes last week, which is hopefully an indication of the ones that we'll see to come again. Actually, when you went round, I was in Liverpool on the day of the North West teachers' strike. You know, it was incredible the amount of which people were generalising, and it was also quite surprising. I expected a minority of people would, but quite a lot of people, you know, most people you spoke to were saying, why aren't we out nationally? When you know, we need to push our union leaders to do more. And I think there's you know, this is something that we need to, that does exist, even though the levels of confidence are quite low, and it's something that we need to try and build networks and pull people together and be able to try and, you know, create the spaces for people to discuss how we can actually push, you know, and relate to that militant minority who aren't just mobilised politically by what's going on because they're against austerity and they want to see an alternative, but who actually want to discuss how they can push the union leaders to do more. So I think, you know, that's an answer in a sense to looking at the weak, you know, the weaknesses of where we are at the moment in terms of the working class movement here, is that actually the more strikes that we're able to get, then, you know, the more this can open up developing people's confidence. Yeah, finally, I mean, I suppose was just the question about, you know, we started the meeting, I suppose, I think the most important point for the meeting really is that, you know, working class globally has grown massively. You've still got a situation where workers have immense power, where this can pull behind others who don't have that power, who are oppressed in the system, and that, you know, resistance is something that's inevitable, that will continually come up in capitalist society, but that this is something that's not, you know, it's not inevitable that this will lead to a revolution, and that, you know, struggle is something that develops consciousness to a point where the kind of the backward ideas or the divisive ideas that people have can, you know, break down in that process of struggle when suddenly they become useless to people who are fighting together. And I think that, you know, this can lead, you know, when these struggles develop, this can lead to points where you have, you know, a revolutionary consciousness develop among workers, which I'm sure will be developed in the next meeting. But this is a momentary thing, and I think that what we have to do is make sure that we have organisations all over the world that are able to, you know, seize those moments really when people are in a revolutionary mindset, and try and take it to the next level and be organised enough. So I think anyone who's not a member of the Socialist Workers' Party should think about joining.